January 15th, 1967. That was a very interesting Sunday. A couple of things happened on that particular day almost 60 years ago. The Rolling Stones appeared on an Ed Sullivan show for the second time. British Prime Minister Harold Wilson arrived in Rome to begin negotiations for the United Kingdom to gain membership in the European Economic Community. And my song, the premier violist in China, escaped from the People's Republic alongside his family by boat to Hong Kong. By April, they ended up moving to the United States. However, if you asked anyone what was the main thing that happened on that day 58 years ago, I think majority of people would only recall one thing, and that was when the Green Bay Packers played against the Kansas City Chiefs. What was so special about that game? I mean, that must have been just an average, normal game, right? Nope, it was not. That was the game the Green Bay Packers beat the Chiefs 35-10 in the first ever Super Bowl in NFL history. POV, you're a child in 1967 on a cold January Sunday, and you decide to go alongside your parents to the first ever Super Bowl in the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum to watch the first ever Super Bowl. At the time, it was unofficial. It wasn't going to be called anything in particular. Only 2/3 of the stadium were full, and those people that did pay only had to pay $12 to get into. Imagine a football ticket or any sports ticket costing $12 nowadays. It'd be unprecedented. 5 years ago, that $12 would have turned into $87. And as of today, that ticket would have been about $113. In comparison, the cheapest ticket available on a secondary market for the recent Super Bowl would have been way more than that, the average price exceeding over $8,000. But what made the first Super Bowl such an important thing? Was it just the fact that the NFL recognized that they should finally have a game where the two best teams played each other, and whoever wins will be known as the greatest team in the world? Yes and no. Technically, nowadays that's accurate, but back in 1967, that wasn't exactly the case, because the NFL technically already had a Super Bowl known as a championship game that they'd done for many years now. But the Super Bowl was a special occasion. It was a special game, not just for the NFL, but for another football league that was around at the time. You may not know of them, but back in July of 1959, a league known as the AFL, the American Football League, formed. And they were the NFL's greatest rivalry by far. You see, the NFL started all the way back in 1920, and for that much time ago, they had plenty of rivals, but no one really standed out. No one lasted as long as the NFL did. So when the AFL showed up in 1959, and they somehow managed to actually stay as long as they did, it was shockwaves to the NFL. They actually had actual competition. Well, that's what they thought until all the way in 1966. On June 8th, 1966, it was announced to the entire world that the NFL and the AFL were going to merge. Under the merging agreement, the leagues maintained separate regular season schedules for the next 4 seasons, from 1966 all the way to 1969, with a final championship game which would be known as, you guessed it, the Super Bowl. Then, officially, in 1970, the merger began, and the AFL and NFL merged into one. All the teams from the NFL and AFL were no longer in 2 separate leagues that, for 4 seasons, the best team from each played against each other once. Now, they were all under one singular umbrella. Now with 1 league and 2 conferences. That way they can tell which one is which. one being known as the AFC and one being known as the NFC. The 14-2 Green Bay Packers beat the 12-13-1 Kansas City Chiefs 35-10. As Green Bay's starting quarterback Bart Starr went for 16 for 23, 250 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, and was sacked 3 times. Compared to the Kansas City quarterback, Len Dawson, who threw 16 for 27, 211 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and was sacked 4 times. As well as backup quarterback Pete Beathard threw for 1 for 5 and 17 yards and was sacked 2 times. This was clearly a defensive game for the first ever Super Bowl. So it's nice to note that at the end of the day, defense does in fact win championships. But when we look at the running backs and the receivers for both teams, we get to see quite a bit of a difference when it comes to who exactly performed here and who really didn't perform here. The Green Bay Packers side, we had Jim Taylor, who had about 17 rushing yards for 56 yards, 1 touchdown, as well as Elijah Pitts, who had 11 attempts for 45 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. We also get to see some other guys like Donnie Anderson, who had 4 for 30, and Jim Gronkowski, who had 2 for 2. But for the receiving game, we had Max McGee, who had 7 catches for 138 yards and both touchdowns by Starr. There was also Carroll Dale, who had 4 catches for 59 yards, and Murray Fleming, who had 2 catches for 22 yards. I also want to mention that Jim Gronkowski also had 1 fumble. On the Chiefs side, we have Mike Garrett, who had 6 rushes for 17 yards, as well as Curtis McClinton, who had 6 carries for 16 yards, and Bert Cohen, who had 3 carries for 1 yard. We move to the receiving game, though. We get to see that some guys also did perform. Curtis McClinton, he only had 34 yards for 2 catches, but he did have the 1 passing touchdown catch. When we go to our receivers, though, we have Curtis Burford, who had 4 catches for 67 yards. Otis Taylor, 4 for 57. Fred Urbness, 2 for 30. And Reggie Corlin, who had 1 for 7. Curtis McClinton also had the 1 fumble for Kansas City. But if we look on the defense, I definitely will feel like we will definitely find some more interesting stuff. On the defense, and here's where things are going to get very fun. Buckingham had 1 sack, 5 tackles, and 5 solo. E.J. Hulub also had 1 sack, 5 tackles, 5 of them being solo. Bobby Bell had half a sack, and Jerry Mays also had half a sack. Andy Rice had 4 tackles, all of them being solo. And Curtis McClinton had the forced fumble. If we look at the Green Bay side, however, we'll find some more impressive stats. Willie Wood had the 1 interception, and he went for 50 yards on the ground. That is impressive. I also want to mention that Waylon Mitchell also had the 1 pick for Kansas City. But Henry Jordan had 1.5 sacks, 3 combined tackles, all 3 of them being solo. Ray Niski had 1 sack, 6 tackles, all 6 being solo. Willie Davis had a sack and a half. Lionel Albridge had half a sack and 4 solo tackles. Leroy Caffey had half a sack and 4 solo tackles. For the punting game, Mike Garrett had 2 punts for 43 yards, compared to Donnie Anderson, who had 1 punt. For the punt return, Mike Garrett had 2 punt returns for 43 yards. For kick returns, Mike Garrett had 2 of them for 43 yards, and for punt returns, he had 2 for 17. Emmett Thomas didn't have any kick returns, but he did have 1 punt return for 2 yards. And Bert Cohen had 4 kick returns for 87 yards, but 0 punt returns. For the Green Bay Packers, Donnie Anderson had 1 punt return. Donnie Anderson had 1 kick return for 25 yards, and he also had 3 punt returns for 25 yards. Willie Wood had 0 kick returns, but he did have 1 punt return, and that went for -2 yards. And Herb Adderley had 2 kick returns for 40 yards and 0 punt returns. Speaking of our punting and kicking, we have our punter, Gerald Wilson, who had 7 punts for 317 yards, with the average being 45.3 yards, and Mike Mercer, who made about a field goal and an extra point. For Green Bay, we have Donnie Anderson, who punted 1 singular time and had 43 yards on the ground. Don Chandler, who was the kicker, had made all 5 extra points. He also had 3 punts, being a grand total of 130 yards, with the average being 43.3 on the ground. A lot of things have happened since January 15th, 1967. We are currently at about 60 Super Bowls at this point. Tom Brady, who was a 6th-round pick, by the way, is now known as the GOAT, having 7 championships. We've had way more teams in the NFL, and a lot of teams are moving around, like Cleveland and Baltimore, Cleveland reappearing, LA, a bunch of different teams moving to LA, right? The Chargers from San Diego, the Rams from St. Louis, the Raiders moving from Oakland to LA, back to Oakland, and all the way to Vegas. The announcement of the Texans and Jaguars being NFL teams in the late 1990s to early 2000s. A lot of things have changed. Ticket prices, again, as I stated before, have also changed. Jersey logos and colors and who owns the team and who is GMing and head coaching the teams have completely changed. Back in 1967, Vince Lombardi was the head coach. Now, for Green Bay, it's a man known as Mike McFleur. For Kansas City, it's completely changed now. Now we have Andy Reid, who is arguably one of the greatest offensive minds in NFL history and probably will go down as one of the greatest head coaches in NFL history. So much has changed since that one game on a Sunday in a cold January. I think it's for the better. I think a lot of things have changed for the good and unfortunately for the worse, but I do think from that one game in January, the NFL has become the best it could truly be. I'm Max England. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Match Archive. And this was the first ever Super Bowl. This was the moment the NFL became the greatest sport in the world.